Welcome to Chapter 9, Ethnic Relations and Race. And the part we're going to be focusing on here will be some definitions around race and ethnicity, and also looking at prejudice and discrimination. Now, certainly these are things that are terms that we've heard of before, but we want to make sure we have a good, clear understanding of what those terms mean. And we're also going to look at the theoretical perspectives, looking at ethnic relations and race. So we're going to look at each of the different theory groups and just their view on ethnic relations and race. And that's what we're going to do in this part one. So things to think about when we're going through this. You know, what is the significance of race in Canadian society? Now, we can also stretch this out to say that these issues and terms, race, ethnicity, prejudice, discrimination, exist in other parts of the world. They're not just, solely a part of North America. They exist elsewhere. And so when we think about it in terms of Canadian society, how can we also extrapolate to other parts of the world? How do race and ethnicity differ? What's the difference between race and ethnicity? Are they the same? Are they different? Let's look at that. We can also consider what is discrimination and what is it, and how does it differ from prejudice? What's the similarity and the differences? What makes prejudice different from discrimination and vice versa? And lastly, how are racial and ethnic relations analyzed, looking at the theoretical perspectives? How do they see it differently? Maybe you'll see something in those theories that resonates with you. So this is what we're going to cover in part one. All right, so let's get started. Let's try very hard to look at this from a sociological perspective and not from a personal bias perspective yet. And it's always a difficult thing when it comes to things like ethnicity and race, but also some of the other topics we'll get into. All right, that's part of what it is to be studying sociology, is to look at them from a distance. And that's what the point was being made in the chapter one when we looked at sociological imagination. It's being able to see things from a distance and not put a personal spin on them. Take a look at things from a public view as well, and get some perspective about how things are experienced from different groups within a same society, and also how they might vary from society to society. All right, let's get started. Good luck, everybody. Race is a category of people who have been singled out as inferior or superior, often on the basis of real or alleged physical characteristics, for things like skin color, hair texture, eye shape, or other specifically selected attributes. Now, this is a socially constructed circumstance, because there's nothing about skin color, hair texture, eye shape that makes people either inferior or superior. It's just a characteristic. And yet with race, this is sometimes what happens, and that's what makes it socially constructed. Now, an ethnic group is a collection of people distinguished by themselves, by others, or by themselves, primarily on the basis of culturally or national characteristics. Ethnic groups have the following characteristics. Usually they have cultural traits like clothing, music, or religion that distinguishes them. Now think in terms of some of this. Now, if you're in another country, like say Kosovo, or in Australia, or in France, or in South America and Brazil, and you look at a Canadian, you will recognize certain clothing, music, or even religion that separates them from you. And that's part of your ethnicity. A sense of community, a feeling of ethnocentrism. I'll get into that on the next slide. Ascribed membership from birth. Now, ascribed means that it's nothing that you earn. It's something that you're born into. And there's a certain amount of territoriality, which just means that we are all in a sort of a geographic area that separates us from others. And that's what makes us an ethnic group of Canadians. We have borders that separate us from the United States. And if you've been following the election in the States, you might be happy with that border and whatever fence might be built to separate us from them. Now, the significance of ethnicity and race is that ethnicity and race form a base for a hierarchical ranking. Now, whether that's good or bad, it is significant, and that's an important feature here. The dominant group holds power over others. Now, there was a classical study that was done, that was The Vertical Mosaic by John Porter, that revealed strong links between class, ethnicity, and race. And so this whole issue of ethnicity and race is something that's an important feature of most societies around the world. Now, if we look at majority and minority groups, majority, this is the dominant group, is the group that is advantaged and has superior resources and rights in a society, whereas the minority group, or the subordinate group, is a group whose members, because of physical or cultural characteristics, again, this is a culturally subjective perspective, it's socially constructed, are disadvantaged or subjected to unequal treatment by the dominant group, and who regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. Now, a distinction here that's important: in majority doesn't mean the most, and minority doesn't mean the least. It oftentimes gets put in the reverse order, where the majority might be represented by the fewer of the population, whereas the minority might be the bulk of the population. Now, with visible minorities, this refers to an official government category of non-white or non-Caucasian persons. Some examples: Black people, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, Arabs. There's over 5 million, or 1 in 6 Canadians, that are visible minorities. Minority does not necessarily mean small. It refers to power or lack thereof of power. Look at this particular chart here. You can see that over time, from 1981 to 2006, both the number and the percentage of visible minorities in Canada has increased. What we will have noticed is, over time, where the different people are coming from in the world has changed over time. If we look at prejudice, prejudice is the negative thinking or the negative attitude based on preconceived notions about members of a selected group. Now, the word comes from, in Latin, pre, which is before, and Judaism, which is judgment. And so it's prejudgment. Now, this prejudgment can have racial overtones, so racial prejudice, which involves the belief that certain racial groups are innately inferior to others and have a disproportionate number of negative traits. Now, again, this is about skin color, hair type. It's socially constructed. There's nothing about those characteristics that make somebody less able to do something, or having certain types of hair and skin color enables you to do things better. And so it's an important distinction. Prejudice is about the thinking, the attitude. Prejudice is rooted in ethnocentrism and stereotypes. Now, ethnocentrism is the tendency to regard your own culture or group as the standard. So this is to say that, our way of doing things is superior, whereas other groups are seen as inferior. Now, certainly, if you're at a sporting event, you cheer for your team as being better than another team's, and that's the less damaging sort of an experience. However, when it comes to looking at culture and you're looking at another culture, ethnocentrism is to say that we see ourselves as the standard. You have to remember that other cultures look at us where they see themselves as the standard, and maybe we're not seen in the kind of light we think we are. And so the other component about this is stereotype. And stereotypes are overgeneralizations about appearance, behavior, or other characteristics of members of a particular group. Now, this comes from some of the effects will be that negative stereotypes result in negative outcomes such as hurt, pain, harm, anguish to those who are receiving the label or the stereotypical perspective. And we get this from a variety of different sources, whether it be through the media, through the jokes that we tell that are ethnic-based jokes, the learning attitudes from parents and classmates and fellow workers and religious associations can all contribute to the stereotypes, which can lead to the thinking that some groups are better than other groups, therefore having an element of prejudice in our lives. Now, social distance, the extent to which people are willing to interact and establish relationships with members of racial and ethnic groups other than their own, is one of the things that is argued to contribute to lessening prejudice. The measure of prejudice, this is from Prejudice, constructed a scale that used the social distance as a criterion. What you're seeing here is that scale. In the following table, those who agreed to number 1 are the least prejudiced. Those who selected number 7 are the most prejudiced. So this is just an example of the different scales that would be available. Now, if we're looking at discrimination as an alternative, at the next point, if you will, discrimination or actions are practices of dominant group members or their representatives that have a harmful impact on members of a subordinate group. This is the sort of refusal to hire somebody, or to associate with certain people, or to become friends of certain people, or to allow membership to those of subordinate groups. Now, the discrimination are actions. They're not thinking. It's taking that thinking and putting it into actions. Now, there's 2 forms of discrimination in the more public forum, and that's the de jure, which is the legal discrimination which is encoded in laws. Now, in Canada, there was de jure discrimination, that is, discrimination encoded in law. But we find that today most of that has, at least in law, been diminished. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means there's more laws that protect against discrimination. The de facto, which is the other way, this is the informal discrimination which is entrenched in social customs and institutions. They're not law, but they become accepted as the way things are. They're more subtle, they're less visible. The research done by Lapierre reveals that people say they would accept others of a subordinate group, but when asked to do so, they have a tendency to refuse, and that would be de facto. The most extreme form of discrimination is the actual homicide of whole subordinate groups. This is also known as genocide. The deliberate, systematic killing of an entire people or nation. Now, this has certainly happened over time, whether it be the killing of the Native Americans by Europeans, the Nazis' destructions of Jews, the ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the former Yugoslavia by Serbs. We've seen it all around the world. That would be the actions of discrimination in an extreme form. So, racism. What is racism? Racism is a set of ideas that implies, I have to emphasize, implies the superiority of one group over another on the basis of biological or cultural characteristics, together with the power to put these beliefs into practice in a way that denies or excludes minority women and men. So this is the very high end, and this is the actions, again, based on a socially constructed belief, but not based on anything that's fact-based. Cultural and biological differences are so minute between different groups, it's hardly worth acknowledging. I mean, the difference between a chimpanzee and a human is less than 2% genetically. So the difference between men and women, whether they are of the same race or different race, has to be far less than that. And so when you look at the difference between races, to think that one race is more superior than the other based on less than 1% of the genetic material, it's kind of hard to understand. Now, there are different types of racism, and some of them exist certainly in our own experience. There is, of course, overt racism. This is making public statements about the inferiority of members of a racial or ethnic group. And we've seen there's been different examples of this, even in Canada in 1998, in Surrey, BC, the beating death of a 65-year-old Sikh temple employee. Polite racism is another form. And this is something that's often described about Canadian racism. It's an attempt to disguise a dislike of others through behavior that outwardly is prejudicial. An example is the study done by Ginsburg found that with equal qualifications, white job applicants received employment offers 3 times more than those of people of visible minorities. And so it's not that it's overt actions against somebody, but it's subtle, less overt, nonetheless still exists. Subliminal racism involves the unconscious criticism of minorities. An example of this was 250,000 Canadians signed a petition that stated that RCMP officers wearing turbans was un-Canadian. Now, it was subliminal in that it was really not intended to be racist towards a group as much as it was to look at a traditional Canadian ceremonial dress and say that somehow that was going to be un-Canadian. And lastly, there is industrial racism, and this is made up of rules, procedures, and practices that directly and deliberately prevent minorities from having full and equal involvement in society. Example of this was the Canadian Civil Liberties Association in 1991 found evidence in 15 employment agencies where there was this form of institutional racism. Now, if you look on page 209 in box 9.1, there's a survey there, and you can just sort of do a quick survey and find that the answers are located on page 210. And that survey is a survey that was done by others, so you can just sort of see how you can, you stack up against other people. Now, lastly, what we'll look at will be the different theoretical perspectives and how they view these issues of ethnic relations and race. And we're going to start with symbolic interactionalists. Now, you're noticing a pair of sunglasses there, and what I want you to consider when looking at theories is theories are like wearing different colored sunglasses looking at the very same thing, that even though you're looking at the same thing, by looking at them with different colored glasses, you have a slightly different view of those experiences. And so none of these theories are absolutely right on about everything. However, they do see ethnicity and race in a way that's different from one another. And that's what we're going to look at. So we're going to begin with symbolic interactionalists. And the theme here is an awareness of the importance of intergroup contact. And remember, symbolic interactionalists are the one theory that is strictly micro meaning looking at the relationships between individual people. So the awareness of the importance of intergroup contact and the fact that it may either intensify or reduce racial and ethnic stereotype and prejudice. And so because of the kind of interaction you can have in intergroup or between friends or between individuals at your school, at your employment, at your soccer game, that contact can either intensify or reduce racial and ethnic stereotyping and prejudice. So they have what they call the contact hypothesis. The contact between people from different groups should lead to favorable attitudes and behaviors when certain factors are present. So 1, you have equal status. 2, you pursue the same goals. 3, you cooperate with one another in achieving those goals. And 4, receive positive feedback with the where they interact with one another in a positive, non-discriminatory way. So that if those 4 things are in play, then you're more likely to have a favorable shift in terms of attitudes and behaviors about different people. And so this is about face-to-face contact, symbolic interactionalists. Now the functionalists, as mentioned in the first chapter, are kind of the traditionalists. Now they see the problem as, how do people of subordinate racial and ethnic groups become part of the dominant group? That's kind of what they see the problem as. And so they say there's three ways by which to do this. One is through assimilation. This is the process by which members of a subordinate racial or ethnic group become absorbed into the dominant culture. So they become and act and behave like those in the dominant culture. So there's a few different means of doing that. One is called cultural assimilation, or it's also known as acculturation. Members of an ethnic group, a dominant group, members of the ethnic group adopt the dominant group's traits, such as the language. So in Canada, if you come from another part of the world, part of the concern or part of the adjustment is learning a new language, and that's part of acculturation. You dress like other people in the same dominant culture, you accept the values and the religion, and sometimes that happens more smoothly and sometimes it happens less smoothly. So the functionalists see this as a concern. The second type of assimilation is structural assimilation or integration. This is where members of the subordinate group gain acceptance. And then biological assimilation or amalgamation is through intermarriage. We see more assimilation based on that relationship, and then having children and sort of building into the dominant culture through biology. And then psychological assimilation, a change in the racial or ethnic self-identification on part of the individual. My ex-father-in-law, he passed away recently. He came from Italy in 1968. And he would see himself as Italian when he first arrived, but as he became more and more Canadian, he was Canadian-Italian. So he became psychologically assimilated in a way. He started to see himself more Canadian than Italian. Ethnic pluralism, this is the coexistence of a variety of distinct racial and ethnic groups within one society. And that's the second image there, where each of those guys are holding a different color. I brought that up a little early, sorry. The egalitarian pluralism or accommodation, ethnic groups coexist in equality with one another. And so even though we're different, we coexist together with our differences, is what ethnic pluralism is. And then lastly, there is the inegalitarian pluralism, or also known as segregation, the spatial and social separation of categories of people by race, ethnicity, class, gender, or religion. And so we've seen lots of examples in our history regarding that, and we see that occurring in other countries still today. All right, we're going to look at conflict theory. Now the theme in conflict is a focus is on the economic stratification. Now conflict theory always looks at the economy or the economics, who's got what resources. And so here they're looking at the economic stratification and access to power, which informs our understanding of ethnicity and race. So one of the first components was internal colonialism, in a situation in which members of a racial or ethnic group are conquered and colonized and forcibly placed under economic and political control by the dominant group. So we could look at the examples of Indigenous people in Canada as having had that experience. Now, one of the elements that, one of the theories, if you will, that conflict theory brings in is what's called split labor market theory. And with split labor market theory, the division of the economy is in two areas of employment. The primary sector, or the upper tier, not in this particular case, it's the second one, it's the lower one where all the $100 bills are. The primary sector or upper tier is composed of higher paid, usually from the dominant group, workers in which they have more secure jobs, less hazardous conditions, whereas the secondary sector or lower tier, that's represented by the 10, the 20, and some change. This is made up of lower paid, often subordinate groups workers in their jobs with little security and hazardous working conditions. And that this labor market theory is suggesting that these lines of division between upper and lower tier is often based on dominant group versus subordinate groups. Now, related to the conflict theory, but on a different criteria, is that of feminism. Feminism, the theme here is minority women are doubly disadvantaged as a result of gender. That gender racism, the interactive effect of racism and sexism in the exploitation of women of color. So they look at not only are women not preferred in society and not advantaged in the same as men are, but they are economically disadvantaged as well. So the combined with split labor market theory, the example is, who is more likely to be a nurse or a custodian in a Canadian hospital? That we often will see women in those roles. And it's not to say we don't see an emergence of more men showing interest in nursing, but we will often see more doctors be men and more women be nurses. And that is what the feminists would describe as part of the ethnic and racism as it relates to sexism. All right, now we're going to move into postmodern. Now, postmodern, the theme here is a high accent on race and ethnicity being totally socially constructed. People are not born into a race or ethnic group, they choose them and give them these terms of subjective meanings. Now, they would refer to what is known as discourse, the different ways of constructing knowledge and social practice. Now, there's a racist discourse. This is the identifiable repertoire of words, images, and practices through which racial power is directed against ethnic and racial minority groups. These theorists want to deconstruct race and ethnicity and to challenge the assumptions and meanings embedded in the social science of race and ethnicity. So instead of allowing those things to carry on, they want to examine the images in the language and deconstruct it to challenge the assumptions behind those words and images to clarify the unity that can exist between people. And then there's discourse of denial, which is racism simply does not exist in our Canadian democratic society. And of course, that's not true. When we identify racism, we try to explain that it's an isolated incident. The critics of this say that as with other applications of postmodern theory, it has too high a level of abstraction, just meaning it's not very specific enough. And it's hard to understand. It offers no basis for evaluating race relations as good or bad. But postmodern, that's not been their sort of cup of tea, as it were. And lastly, as an alternative theory is what's known as critical race theory. The premise here is one, the belief that racism is such an ingrained feature in North America society that it appears ordinary and normal. And secondly, interest convergence is a critical factor in bringing about social change. Interest convergence is the belief that white elites tolerate racial advantages only if the elites will achieve their own interests. So what I would encourage you to do is just to get an overview. On page 222, table 9.1, you'll see an overview of the theories that we've just gone through here now. I hope this has been helpful. And this is the end of part 1. The second video that we'll look at will be part 2, looking at the remainder of this chapter. All right, carry on.